This is the history of One Punch Man. After watching this video, you'll be a certified expert in One Punch Man history, which of course is the highest honor any Caped Baldy fan can possibly have, right? One Punch Man might not be the first series that comes to mind when you think of deep and fascinating lore.
Leave me alone!
But believe it or not, the series has a very interesting and relatively well documented history that dates back thousands of years once you piece together all of the information provided in the manga, bonus chapters, and some portion of the webcomic. Don't worry though, if you haven't read the webcomic, I won't be touching on spoiler stuff until the very end, so I'll make sure to let you know once I get there. I gotcha. I decided it was best to split the timeline we'll be going over into two parts, before Saitama and after Saitama, aka BS and AS, which is referring to everything that happens before Saitama was born and pretty much everything that we see play out in the manga. This means that the current year in the story is 25 AS because Saitama is currently 25 years old. Make sense? Well, even if it doesn't, I'm sorry, but you know, we gotta get started. So with that out of the way, let's start with what is probably the earliest sign of human life in One Punch Man, the underground base of the Monster Association. In the manga, in the heat of the Monster Association arc, Saitama, Flashy Flash, and Monako ride a rail cart through the underground base of the Monster Association, and this is also when we find out that this was actually originally the home of the Subterraneans and possibly even others before that. The architecture of the base is definitely a giveaway that this underground city is likely thousands of years old at the minimum. One thing that kind of verifies this is the mural of God shown in chapter 112 of the manga. It was first revealed in this chapter after Orochi is one-shotted by Saitama. The impact of the punch starts destroying the altar room that they're in. Orochi then crawls towards the crumbling altar, still thinking it was his, but as the altar room is collapsing, the entirety of the mural was revealed to be one created for God, not Orochi. There's a lot that can be unpacked with this mural, like the writing prophesizing God's return, and the fact that this dude in the corner here is just casually chucking a baby in the air. I feel like nobody really talks about that, but anyways, all that aside, for our purposes, we need this mural to establish a timetable of how far back the recorded history of One Punch Man actually goes. This is likely the oldest evidence of human activity we've seen so far in the series, and its hieroglyphic style likely means that it dates back to the One Punch Man version of Egyptian times. We can also see in a bonus illustration of one of the recent One Punch Man volumes that there's this little room with the God Cube and a sarcophagus which supports this timetable. If we're going by real life standards, this sets a potential starting point of about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, but we'll just set 5,000 BS as our first point in the One Punch Man timeline. As a side note, there is a part in the manga where Sairochi depicts two Adam and Eve type characters as the first humans eating an apple that seems to be from some kind of like weird snake monster. Although this might be hinting to something that actually happened and might also be a sign of God's influence in humanity from the very beginning, it might have also simply been a visualization of what Psychos was talking about at the time, so we'll, you know, ignore that for now. But just to be sure, why don't we ask Psychos herself? And we'll be doing it using today's sponsor, Poly AI. This app has over 1 million downloads and lets you have conversations with any anime character you can imagine. Alright, I found her here, so let's get to asking. How far back does the history of your world go?
Well, the earliest recorded history of the world was during the Stone Age.
No, but I mean specifically the One Punch Man world.
The first hero appeared in 1979. But monsters started appearing as early as the 1950s.
That does not match up with our video at all, so we're just gonna ignore that. Well, there you have it, but if you want to ask her yourself or any other One Punch Man character, then simply click my link in the description below to gain access to any fictional or non-fictional character you can possibly think of. You can ask Saitama what the deal of the day is, ask Watchdog Man what's under the costume, and you could even practice your Riz skills on Tatsumaki. You know, educational stuff. What's even better is that you can use my code ANIME88 to get access to premium features on the app you normally wouldn't have. So make sure to check out Poly AI today and use my link to help support the channel. But anyway, now for the next bit of One Punch Man world lore, we actually have to fast forward to a future moment about the past that still hasn't technically happened yet in the manga. Very confusing, but in less confusing terms, there was a major event that occurred 800 years ago before the present timeline that was revealed in the webcomic. So that being said, we have to go into spoiler territory for the rest of the video. Alright, with that said, let's talk about the story of the Cruel Dragon from chapter 119 of the webcomic. In this chapter, Saitama stumbles across this like real life LARPing situation where these guys in medieval medieval armor tells Saitama about a cruel dragon that once existed 800 years ago and once terrorized humanity. In just a matter of days, it took countless lives and destroyed whatever land it touched down on. Eventually, many brave heroes fought hard enough to weaken the dragon, and seal masters quickly trapped the essence of the dragon into 9 seal stones that are now being stored and protected at 9 temples. It turns out that there's also an enemy group called Deathbone that is trying to reawaken the dragon and have been at constant battle with the knights for hundreds of years. Saitama sees this as an opportunity to fight a super strong monster, so he goes on to speedrun all of the temples, collects all of the seal stones, and finally resurrects the dragon just to, one-shot it and find his way to the supermarket before they close in order to buy some bananas. Although this comes off as a funny throwaway sequence to kick off the chapter, it can't be ignored that the seal stones that were described in the story very much resemble the god cubes that were revealed in the manga. On top of this, many keen readers might have also noticed a very sneaky piece of foreshadowing placed in the manga during Saitama's fight with Garo. After Garo hits Saitama into the ground so freaking hard that it bulges the other side of the planet, that bulging piece of land rose from the ocean to uncover this ancient temple that has a certain cruel dragon statue placed on top of it. Many speculate that this was actually an avatar of God that rose to destroy the earth 800 years ago, and the sealing of the cruel dragon parallels what seems to be going on with God. Touching the god cubes allows you to communicate with him, much like the seal stones are used to reach the dragon. The essence of the dragon is sealed away in the stones, and it seems like God's physical body might also be locked away in the moon somehow. Now, if the story of the cruel dragon really is just a retelling of the time that God was first sealed 800 years ago, it kind of makes you wonder if the events that are happening in the manga right now is really just history repeating itself. And if that's the case, then that means that there might have been a Saitama type character 800 years ago that, much like Saitama, was this normal everyday guy that trained so hard that he eventually removed his limiter and became strong enough to defeat the cruel dragon. Pretty cool to think of a medieval times Saitama, isn't it? Under normal circumstances, it would have been likely that the manga version of One Punch Man would cut this cruel dragon story out entirely, but seeing as how seeds for this small storyline have already been planted, it's a safe bet that we can add this to our timeline. So this is officially the next point on our timeline, 800 BS. For the next piece of history that'll close the gap between 800 years BS and the day Saitama was born, we actually have to once again return to chapter 119 of the webcomic, which is of course where I just explained all this cruel dragon story stuff came from. Later in this chapter, Amai Mask takes Saitama out to a restaurant in order to recruit him to be the face of the Hero Association. Before getting to all that stuff though, Amai Mask briefly covers a portion of world history that actually leads to the current state of humanity right now, basically covering like a 300-year gap. Amai starts by mentioning that the world is currently entering a third era of change. In the first era of change long ago, Earth had many nations that fought for land and resources through countless world wars. Eventually the population decreased to the point that humanity finally started to prioritize the preservation of future generations and unified under one world government. In the second era of change, the aftermath from all the world wars caused the Earth to slowly erode and create toxic, uninhabitable sections of the planet. Rapid climate change and rising sea levels gave birth to what are now known as monsters, which then forced humanity to migrate to the center of a supercontinent where they all live now and where all of the major cities from A to Z exist. This is actually very reminiscent of an Attack on Titan scenario, where like the cities from A to Z are pretty much the stronghold of humanity at this point, and I feel like that isn't touched on enough in the series, so I actually hope this becomes a bigger plot point eventually. Well, all that being said, the world is currently entering a third era of change where monsters are now becoming more intelligent and rising in numbers dramatically. Amai also points out that just a few years ago, monster appearances were very rare, and now, as Saitama actually said in chapter 186 of the manga, you're more likely to run into a monster than find a beetle scurrying on the ground. This bit of extremely valuable world building laid out by Amai Mask seems to explain the origin of monsters and the fact that humans were engaging in world wars as far back as a few hundred years. Amai describes the first era of change as long ago, meaning it was probably many generations before theirs, and the time it would take for a mass migration of humanity to a supercontinent, along with the establishment of a world government, in my opinion kind of confirms that these events happened at a minimum of 200 or 300 years ago. So that being said, we'll add the 3 eras of change beginning at 300 BS. And for continuity's sake, this would be roughly 500 years after the events of the Cruel Dragon. So now we finally arrive to probably the greatest moment in One Punch Man human history, and that of course is the day that Saitama was born. He came into this world bald, and he's bald now. Not much is known about Saitama's early days, and essentially nothing is known about who raised him. Thankfully though, I've dug deep enough into bonus chapters and various other bits of valuable info that might finally uncover some of the mysteries of Saitama's early life that help explain how he became the unstoppable bald hero we all know and love today. Along with this, there's still a plethora of major events that occur from the moment Saitama was born to the current timeline that truly show how quickly the world is approaching extinction level disaster. And surprisingly, it all starts with the #1 hero, potentially the first ever hero, Blast, which is where we'll be picking up in part 2 of the history of One Punch Man. Well, today we start with another major god event as we pick up our timeline 20 years before the current events of the manga, or 5AS. If you didn't watch part 1 of this series or just completely forgot, our timeline is split into 2 halves, BS and AS, which stands for before Saitama and after Saitama. This means that 5AS is around the same time that Saitama was 5 years old and likely in grade school. It also means that 25AS is the year of the current timeline as Saitama is 25 years old. Got it? Great. Well, during 5AS, while Saitama was busy learning the alphabet and having nap time, this is when future #1 hero Blast begins his journey with his partner and a group of collaborators to research and search for God cubes scattered around the planet. Much of this journey is a mystery, but throughout this video, you'll see parts of Blast's quest for the God cubes and a cataclysmic event that changes everything for him. But we'll get to that towards the end. Starting at 5AS, we now move on 2 years later to 7AS, which is the day that Tatsumaki is busted out of the Tsukiyomi research facility by Blast. We see in Tatsumaki's flashbacks that when she was a kid, she was experimented on for her Esper powers for 3 years. This was all until an out-of-control monster forced everyone to evacuate the lab and leave Tatsumaki behind. As she accepts her fate, she's saved by none other than Blast, who was seemingly there to recover a God cube at that time. He encourages her to protect what's closest to her, that of course being Fubuki, who's still just a small child at that point. Taking that advice to heart, Tatsumaki locates where Fubuki's being held and brutally gets rid of the people that are holding her captive. It turns out that Fubuki actually witnessed all of this happening, which scares Fubuki enough to awaken her own Esper powers and is the beginning of their unhealthy relationship. Tatsumaki, now obsessed with keeping Fubuki safe while dismissing anyone that tries to come into her life for fear of being taken advantage of again, and Fubuki now in a constant struggle trying to surpass her sister out of fear. Now, just before Saitama gets reintroduced into our timeline, we have to move forward one more time to 10AS, just 3 years after Blast saves Tatsumaki. Also, this is when we start dipping into webcomic spoiler territory, so if you don't want to get spoiled, make sure to skip to the timestamp that you see on your screen right now. Now, to me, 10AS is probably one of the most fascinating years in One Punch Man history, simply because it's the year that Blast fought none other than the ninja leader of the ninja village where Flashy Flash and Sonic were both raised. Very little is known about why this battle happened in the first place, but considering his primary goal was to collect God cubes at the time, it's possible that the ninja leader was storing one in the village. After all, the ninja village greatly resembles the research facility Tatsumaki was being held in, which both also happen to look like God cubes. I feel like that was kind of intentional. I don't know, let me know what you think in the comments. Well, to that point, the ninja leader had been alive for hundreds of years and carried some inhuman characteristics like having multiple heartbeats and possessing an insane amount of strength and speed. Again, sticking to the facts though, on this day Blast has an epic battle with the ninja leader and pushes him to near death. This causes him to go dormant in a recovery capsule for a whole 15 years, and it appears Blast was unsuccessful in obtaining the God Cube because he returns to the village 6 years later. This is jumping ahead a little bit in our timeline, but for the sake of covering the Ninja Village storyline and all the webcomic spoiler stuff that'll be in this video in one go, it just makes more sense, so follow along with me here. That being said, we move to 16AS, which is the day that Flashy Flash took out his ninja village in one night. This was after he was fed up with the harsh life of being an assassin that he and many others were forced to live. After creating this massacre and fleeing, Sonic is shown to have been poisoned by Flashy in order to keep him out of commission during the massacre. Well, the really crazy stuff happens next, because soon after Sonic comes back, Blast Blast mysteriously appears and finishes the job that Flashy started. Without any real explanation why, he completely takes out the remainder of the ninja village and leaves as mysteriously as he arrived. It really isn't known why Blast decided to show up that day, but considering his prior battle with the ninja leader, it's possible he was there to recover the God Cube that he failed to grab the first time. As I said, this is just speculation, but it seems like the most likely case here. Well, like I said, there is a ton of mystery surrounding the events of that night in 16AS, but what finally isn't a mystery is some of Saitama's early childhood life. At the time of the Ninja Village massacre, Saitama was actually just 16 years old. During this time, it was also said by one himself that Saitama's store was once robbed by a guy holding a knife, and when he confronted Saitama at the register to hand over all the money, Saitama thought the guy was purchasing the knife and actually tried looking for a barcode on it to scan. This shows Saitama picked up his benevolent, nonchalant personality way before we meet him in the manga, but this actually wasn't the case when he was younger. During his middle school days, Saitama was shown to be a really insecure and worried kid. To really understand what caused such a dramatic change in his personality, we have to backtrack from 16AS to 12AS, which is 4 years before the events we just covered. Jumping around a little bit, I know, but I'm sure you guys are following along, so we're fine. Well, during 12AS, Saitama was just 12 years old, which, believe it or not, is also when he has his first ever encounter with the monster. In this time, Saitama's just starting middle school, and it's made pretty clear right away that he's being singled out as the class dummy by his own teacher. On top of that, we get introduced to a young Moomin rider who gets beaten up after trying to defend 3 kids from some bullies trying to steal their lunch money.
Somebody call an ambulance!
Well, later that day, after Saitama lays in bed at home, we see a news broadcast on TV announcing that a monster sighting had just been reported. It's apparently the first time in 9 months that a monster sighting had been reported, which is alarming because data recovered over the past 10 years at that point showed that monster appearances had been gradually increasing. Now, it's really crazy to think that a single monster sighting was thought of as such a huge deal at the time, considering currently in the manga, as Saitama says best himself, people are just as likely to run into a monster as they are to stumble across a beetle on the ground. I think it really puts into perspective how out of control things are actually getting in the current manga timeline, because we now know how rare monster appearances were just a decade prior. Getting back to the story, the next day at school, Saitama's embarrassed by his teacher yet again and told to meet him directly after school. As he makes his way to his teacher's office, he's confronted by the bullies that beat up Moomin Rider, and they demand that Saitama hands over his lunch money. At this point, Saitama's fed up with the constant bullying from his teacher and now these guys, so he pretty much tells the bullies to shove it. Although courageous, he still isn't the powerhouse we know him to be today, so he gets easily put down by the bullies and has 200 yen taken from him. In that moment, the monster that was sighted the day before smashes into one of the bullies and demands he hands over his change. This turns out to be a piggy bank monster called Piggy Bankon that's obsessed with smashing into people and collecting the change that they drop. Although it was only 200 yen, which comes out to be like less than $1.50, it's all the money that Saitama has, so he chases after the monster. After a while, the monster finally stops to confront Saitama in an alley and bashes him into a wall before escaping. Once he comes to, he finds out that the military had taken out the monster, and Saitama is discouraged by how he can't seem to ever get a win in life and wonders if he'll ever survive in this world with how weak he is. Well, little does he know that this would be the one and only defeat that he'd ever receive from a monster, and not only will he survive in this world, he'll actually be on top of the food chain. My boy Saitama's come a long way, I'm proud of him. Well, just before we get to his peak, we have to jump ahead 9 years to 21AS. This is 4 years before the current events of the manga, and when Genos' life was completely destroyed by the Mad Cyborg. On that day, the Mad Cyborg was born after a malfunction occurred while transferring a human brain into a cyborg body. After this malfunction, it then went on to destroy Genos' whole town and unfortunately kill his family. Soon after, he was discovered by Dr. Kuseno and transformed into a cyborg himself in hopes of one day finding the Mad Cyborg and destroying it. Just a year later in 22AS, we finally pick up where the manga begins. Saitama is on his way home from another failed job interview when he saves a big-chinned kid from getting pulverized by crab launchers. Crablante. Now, although you might know how this fight plays out, what many people don't know is that Crablante was actually reported to be a Tiger level threat, which we later find out usually requires at least one A-class hero to defeat. This means that on that day, before he had even started his training, Saitama performed an A-class level feat by defeating the crab monster. My boy was built different from the very beginning, wasn't he? That aside though, on this day in 22 AS, Saitama starts his legendary journey to become the strongest, and along the way, the Hero Association gets started by a millionaire who was the grandfather of the big-chinned kid that Saitama saved. His actions literally inspired the creation of the Hero Association, which is something that I feel like gets forgotten sometimes. Well, between 22 AS and the current year of 25 AS, Saitama removes his limiter, and 2 years before the current timeline, at 23 AS, we finally get to God's fateful encounter with Blast. A cataclysmic event occurred where God made his first recorded appearance in nearly 1,000 years. This was when the #1 hero Blast had an epic encounter with Elder Centipede, which was actually alluded to in season 2 of the anime. Just when it seemed like Blast would finish off the giant bug for good, God appeared right before his eyes for the very first time. Up until that point, Blast had only heard of God and his ability to create powerful monsters as he was investigating the God cubes with his partner and a team of collaborators. Once God appeared before Blast, he offered him his power as he always does, and Blast of course rejects it. This is when God summons something so powerful that it seemingly almost kills the #1 hero. This encounter is handled off panel, but it's possible that God had created another avatar much like he did with Garo and fought Blast through this newly transformed being. Seeing as how this flashback mentions and shows Blast's partner for the first and last time, it is possible that he was the one who accepted God's power for some reason and turned against Blast. This is speculation, but I also say this because it makes events that come later on in this timeline make a lot more sense. Sticking with the facts though, after his near-death encounter with God, Blast dedicates himself to working against God behind the scenes and at some point teams up with a powerful group of alien heroes. Several heroes stand out above the rest and become what's now known as the S-Class, and the events of the manga play out as the One Punch Man is a story with a surprisingly deep and interesting history, and I just want to thank all of you for coming along with me on this journey as we come to the end of our History of One Punch Man series. Do me a huge solid and hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, as I post One Punch Man content on this channel literally multiple times a week, much like the video you see on your screen right now. So I'll see you there.